When we're talking shovel ready, there's almost nothing we can do that will produce jobs faster than for government to incent renewable energy projects. We talk about how to do it fast and how to do it right, and how $1 billion will equal 50,000 jobs really quickly. And thanks to COVID and other countries recognizing our talent, our clean tech companies right now are at grave risk of foreign takeover. We need to move fast to protect them and build a durable economy that can vaccinate Canada from the price of oil. Join us to hear a lot more. Hi there. Welcome to the Clean50 CleanReset webcast series. I'm your host, Gavin Pitchford, the CEO of Delta Management Group and also the Executive Director of the Canada's Clean50 Awards organization. Delta's 28 years old. Today, we're the only executive search firm in Canada whose practice is now devoted exclusively to green professionals. Our typical mandates include Chief Sustainable Development Officers, ESG analysts, clean tech CEOs, smart building strategy experts, or environmental NGO leaders. As we launched this then new area of practice some 10 years ago, we became aware of two things. First, that solving climate change was going to take insight and ideas from every single corner of the economy. And second, that sustainability leaders in different silos were simply not engaging with each other as they needed to be. So to meet that need, we founded the Canada's Clean50 Awards program. And every year since, we've identified, recognized, and most importantly, connected 50 individual leaders, 10 emerging leaders, and the project managers from the top 20 sustainability projects across the country and from every possible segment of the economy. Each year, we bring all of these new honorees together at the annual Clean50 Summit. We connect them with each other and also with our existing Clean50 members. We now have some 600 amazing people who have won Clean50 awards for their impact in fighting climate change. They range from the CEOs and senior executives of organizations like Loblaw, HP, and Unilever, to brilliant R&D scientists, and to entrepreneurs you've never heard of, toiling away at small business and labs and universities across the country. Today, we're presented with the COVID-19 crisis. Typically, when crises hit, governments push panic buttons and jump on any project to create jobs, as long as it's shovel ready. We build a bridge here, an extra line of highway there, and soon after, the jobs go away. The problem with that approach is that it's incredibly short-sighted and at best a temporary fix. What we need to do instead is to have a clean reset strategy, shovel ready and shovel worthy, projects to rebuild Canada's economy and do so with durable long-term jobs in strategic industries. How? By focusing on investing in the low carbon economy, one that can grow and prosper as climate change increasingly impacts the entire globe. Climate solutions alone are expected to be a $26 trillion opportunity over the next 9 years, and Canada can get its share. But to do so, we need to decide right now if we want to be one of the suppliers or build another lane of highway and become the buyers of those solutions. For every $1 million our government invests in the dying fossil fuel extraction industry, we get just 2.7 jobs. But done right, an investment in just about any part of the low carbon economy generates between 3 and 5 times that number, and as many as nearly 10 times that number. Between 7 and 20 odd jobs per $1 million of investment, depending upon the industry segment. Best of all, a lot of that investment is just that, an investment, money that will be repaid or recouped by taxpayers, not swallowed up because some Saudi-based oil sheikh or the Russian oligarch decided to bump production and push down oil prices to a number that puts Canada out of business. When the COVID crisis hit, about 100 of our members immediately recognized we had this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, that when we reset, that when we use that incoming government impetus spending, we could do so to set Canada on a clear path to a more prosperous future where we export our brain power instead of our resources. 58% of Canadians support that idea. This group of industry experts spent several weeks working on a plan as to how we might best invest government stimulus spending to expand our low carbon economy. And then on Earth Day, we put that plan forward in a letter to the government, ultimately signed by over 220 members of the Clean50, 170 of their employers, ranging from multinationals like HP Canada and Unilever to small, medium enterprises. Another 35 organizations, including the Green Party of Canada and the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, immediately endorsed the plan. The latter said our plan wouldn't just create jobs, it would save lives and cut government health costs. And now, via a series of web and podcasts, we're bringing together expert panels to discuss various elements of our Clean Reset plan and discuss the ways in which our proposals can help Canada rebuild with a low carbon economy and millions of future-proof and durable jobs. I'd like to introduce Dan Vinolovich. He's an accomplished analyst, strategist, and advocate who works with government and business to navigate the energy transition and find opportunities in climate solutions. He's the principal of Polaris Strategy and Insight and a senior associate at Clean Energy Canada. Dan was brought into the Clean50 in 2020. Dan, give us a little bit of your insight into where we are right now.
I think it's useful if we actually rewind a few months to the pre-COVID times and remind ourselves of what things were like. So we had a lot of momentum building behind energy transition and taking action on climate change, driven by policy responses from governments. Increasingly, investors were wanting to move their money this way. And then we also saw a lot of innovation and commercialization and scaling up of clean technologies, which were also bringing those costs down. So things were really progressing quite well. And then bam, COVID comes along and everything has changed. And I think initially there was a lot of concern as to, are we just going to do economic recovery the way we did it a decade ago? Or are we going to do it different? Are we going to lean into those opportunities associated with clean technology and the trajectory we are on? And I think there was some concern as to whether or not there would still be public support for going down that path. And what we're seeing from public opinion research is that Canadians are still very much on board with that. In fact, quite a few Canadians are even more encouraged to go down that route and feel it's even more of an imperative. And so there was just polling that came out last week from Abacus Research and Clean Energy Canada that found that 58% of Canadians say, you know what, we have to double down on taking action on climate change as we're navigating this economic recovery. And we see that around the world. We also see that the public trusts government more now than they did 6 months ago. And so government, I think, has a lot of license to do a shovel-worthy type of economic recovery. And we're beginning to see some other jurisdictions around the world that are doing just that. Last week, we saw both the European Union and Germany roll out economic recovery plans that are the greenest, cleanest plans that we've ever seen, that are going to drive billions of dollars into clean energy and clean tech. And so I think the question now for Canada is, are we going to follow that lead? We have a clean energy and clean tech sector in Canada that numbers in the hundreds of thousands, spread across the country. So are we going to build on that in the next decade, both to achieve things like our Paris climate commitments, but also to really position Canada as a competitive leader in clean tech?
Dan, thanks so much. There's the landscape right now. I'm going to ask Carol-Ann Brown to help us drill down. Carol-Ann is a geographer who's passionate about leveraging clean technology to achieve a sustainable and prosperous society. As vice president at Delphi, she supports clients to accelerate the commercialization of clean tech, and through Globe, convenes conversations that advance the clean economy. She's part of our Clean50 2020 cohort. Cab, give us your thoughts.
Thanks, Gavin. I thought I'd start by bring us down to basics. What is clean technology? And in its simplest form, it's any process or product or service that reduces environmental impacts. And this is a wide variety of things. You know, it's easy for us to think about, renewable energy, wind turbines, solar, etc. But it's also a whole wide range of other things that we find across all the sectors of our economy. So that means a variety of hardware and enabling software solutions. So if you think of Ecobee, a great Canadian company, smart thermostat. that helps to make sure you're using your energy efficiently in your house. Or Morgan Solar, another good Canadian company that brings solar power solutions. Things like Carbon Cure, cement that absorbs carbon dioxide. Or MindSense, which is a company that uses a smart sensor on the shovels in order to identify good ore quality to have optimal production and reduces environmental footprints. There's a whole range across Canada, and so it's good to think about the things that can be used in your homes and your communities across industry that reduces that environmental impact. It's also important to think about what we call the stages of development, right? And so we have things that we're using right now. Most of us have seen wind turbines on the landscape. Most of us have double or triple paned windows, even if we've had to put them in ourselves. These are all immediately deployable clean technologies, things that make a difference today. But there's also things that will take 10, 15 years to develop, things that are being tested and scaled right now, things that are in, their first commercial application in the field. And all of those technologies need different things to get to the finish line. And that's where we come to, what do they need? How can government, especially right now, and as we move to recovery, help them get across the finish line faster? Some of them need more support with testing. The labs, like everywhere else, are trying to be following protocols to keep everyone safe. And so it's slowed down that process that is usually very, very tight in its timelines in order to also meet technology validation, verification, and then getting the next stage of development. What can we do to help that for these companies? Things like financing. I know that Andree-Lise is going to speak to this later, but that's a very crucial piece for companies right now that have been in a very serious liquidity challenge in the last couple of months. And so the measures that we use to help accelerate their development and deployment have got to be a mix that are appropriate for their stage of development. And this is where government is important to be a first user. How do they support immediate deployment? And I think we're going to hear some examples soon. How do they think about medium and longer term development needs? And how do we all move our companies to scale and grow and export? And so that we in Canada gain those benefits, both economically, through jobs, and environmentally.
Got it. Okay. So let's talk about some of the more practical feet on the ground approach. I'm going to turn to Ron Dizy and Fidel Reijerse. Ron is an industrial engineer who's been a successful venture capitalist. He's been the CEO of a leading clean tech company, the leader of the Advanced Energy Center at Innovation Hub Mars, and he's now the chief commercial officer at energy services company Spark Power. In short, he's an expert on clean tech, venture capital, renewable energy, and he's been one of our Clean50 members since 2013. Fidel is the president of RESCo Energy, a long-standing solar energy and construction firm that specializes in commercial and industrial rooftop solar projects. Fidel is an active industry leader and has been since 2005. He was part of our Clean50 class of 2016 for his role on policy development in Ontario, including especially the Green Energy Act, which resulted in so much solar being deployed in Ontario. Guys, the renewable energy industry right now, for the most part, is deploying clean technology from other countries like China onto Canadian fields, onto Canadian rooftops in the form of windmills, solar panels. You guys are feet on the ground. How much more expensive is renewable energy to deploy than nuclear or coal?
It's cheaper already. We can deploy solar for certainly no more than 10 cents a kilowatt hour, maybe even a little bit less at scale. Ontario's latest nuclear refurbishments will come in, even assuming very long lives on those reactors, at something like 14, 15 cents. And so one of the challenges is that the decisions we're making around nuclear now, which does supply baseload power, and there are some advantages to that, but it does feel like we're locking in to 15 cents for 50 years. we're not setting ourselves up to take advantage of continuing cost reductions in solar, wind, and frankly other forms of energy efficiency.
I was just going to add to Ron's point. I mean, cost is an interesting metric, and it's one that needs to be measured in a number of different ways. To Ron's point, nuclear is a long-term investment. It's a lock-in, but it's also central. And so you now have to get that power around the province, and you have to get it to places. So one of the key benefits on the renewable side is the ability to be able to place that power source near the load as well. And so when we look at economic recovery and we look at how different areas will bounce back and what the energy requirements are in those areas, solar and wind are very quick deployments. They're very targeted deployments. So not only are they cheaper, but there's a great deal of policy flexibility that's left for the system operator and for the governments to deploy in a go forward base. So when you think about the rate base and what as electricity consumers we're paying for on our bill, that flexibility is kind of a free add-on to the idea of renewables. Not only is it cheaper, but it's more flexible. And so it has a number of other benefits that may not fit in that direct cost requirement that's already a checkbox, but I think that are add-ons to all of that.
Not to mention, we don't have to deal with the waste for the next 3 million years.
It's hard to argue with a free fuel source.
I think one other point to add, if you sort of ask, so why are we spending 14 or 15 cents on nuclear when you could build solar for 10? You have the notion of baseload power, and yes, we would have to add storage to solar if we're going to kind of create an equivalent resource. I think the other big point that would be made by proponents of nuclear is that it creates a lot of jobs. Well, that's exactly what we're talking about doing by creating the environment and the conditions for widespread adoption of solar, just at lower cost.
It's not just about those jobs, but it's speed to market. Trying to bring jobs in the nuclear industry online is a very, very long process. And bringing jobs online in renewables is often less than a 3 to 6 month process. And that's skilled labor. Those are trades. That's the fundamental backbone of our economy in terms of true GDP. And it comes on quickly. And it creates very long-lasting skilled trade capacity in the province, and in the country. So it's again, I just add these extra components are sort of free add-ons to the idea of generating using renewables. So the French government's just invested $16.9 billion into their aerospace industry in order to protect it. If the Canadian government were to give you just 1 billion Canadian dollars to deploy in the renewable industry, how would you guys spend it? What could we get? How many jobs? Take me through that. I think this is one of those incredibly powerful parts of the statement, because it just shows the power of the multiplier effect, right? If you were to take $1 billion and invest it in renewables, there's probably another $3 billion that comes in from the private sector. This isn't government funding that drives the development of renewables. And that's an enormous multiplier. I mean, that gets you to, a $5 billion GDP mark, which is enormous and quickly. $1 billion invested in solar would generate 50,000 jobs or so a year, and that would also produce about 2 terawatt hours of electricity, which is enough to generate or enough to power 250,000 homes, which is a city the size of Ottawa. But I think what's really interesting is when you look at that and you think about those jobs, and you think about the fact that those are income taxed jobs, you're really looking at probably less than 2 years in terms of actually seeing that come back to the government in terms of the net benefit to the income tax revenue pool. And I think that's a phenomenal conversation around the flow, because you're not really spending money, you're flowing money. And you're moving that money in, you're leveraging it up, you're creating jobs quickly, and then you're seeing that money go back into the government coffers in a very, very, very short period of time. And I think that's something that it should be a very active part of this conversation. How often do you spend money to get a really strong return like that? So I think, I'm sure there's lots more to add to that, but that's my piece.
There's a point here about the skilled jobs that is useful to highlight, which is we have the training spaces, we have the courses, we have the people who've already been doing this. That means that they are deployable right away. It's not a hypothetical if we got the colleges to be able to be teaching this. We've had enough development in Canada that they are already been teaching it. There are people out there who know how to do this tomorrow if need be.
I think it's also important to say it's not hypothetical that this is an effective form of stimulus. Like, we have to remember that, you know, the economy is in pretty dire straits. And so we do need to be creating jobs, creating economic activity. And I think there are some critics who will say, stop trying to jam your green agenda into this. You know, that's going to lead to less jobs, and what we need are jobs. But there's a study that was just published recently that came out of Oxford, where they actually surveyed over 200 economic experts and central bankers from around the world on different types of approaches to stimulus. And what that survey found was that clean stimulus policies actually deliver better economic returns, as well as delivering other kinds of co-benefits, whether it's cleaner air, less climate pollution. So, you know, this isn't just a matter of Fidel and Ron, you know, actors in the clean energy sector who are trying to line up to get some money, and yeah, they'll create some jobs. I mean, this is actually grounded in reality and lived experience around the world. And this is what the experts are saying is the most effective path forward, not just environmentally, but economically as well.
I'd like to add 2 points, and follows on both what Dan and Fidel have been saying, and it's this. Number one, there is actually underlying demand for these for renewable energy and for energy efficiency, which I would add as another way to get similar traction and similar jobs. The second point would be, you know, this economic stimulus is all around efficiency of the dollars relative to jobs. This clean energy, these ideas, solar, wind, and even energy efficiency, all sort of have the characteristic that, you know, roughly half of the money will go to the materials that you need to deploy, and about half will go to jobs. That's incredibly efficient in terms of creating jobs for per dollar of stimulus, and it's incredibly scalable as well. When we're talking about the numbers that Fidel has sort of thrown out, $1 billion driving $4 or $5 billion of GDP, we're talking about 2 gigawatts of solar. That's in the context of a Canadian system that's maybe 100 gigawatts, 120 gigawatts. We're not really talking about a ton yet. So you could even imagine even more levels of stimulus if we decided we wanted to do that. This is not something that runs out of steam with a short amount of dollars.
Or sunlight, never mind the steam. Guys, I've seen numbers like, for example, if you put $1 million into oil and gas, it produces 2.7 jobs. I've seen numbers anywhere between 7.5 and 12 in terms of the number of jobs that you can generate for $1 million out of our in the renewable space. Is that your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. That goes to exactly the point that this is actually a very efficient way to create jobs. The amount of material that we need relative to the dollars is only about half. When you go to the very heavy industries, you're spending a huge amount of money on equipment, and it drives relatively few jobs per dollar spent. This would be one of the most efficient ways to create jobs.
I want to add to that, but I think we need to take in consideration, it's very, very important to make the transition to the green molecules. And for that, we need talented chemical engineer from the oil and gas sector. It's very nice to have renewable energy. We are an investor in the sector. I believe in solar for 20 years, very supportive of that. But my conclusion, if we want to go through a circular economy, and if you want to produce different products, and we need to replace the plastic play, we need this important, talented skill set we have in this country. And it's all about green molecules. And I think we need to transition clearly in renewables, but we need to transition in green molecules.
Andree-Lise Méthot is the founder and managing partner of Cycle Capital, Canada's largest clean tech venture fund. She has founded or co-founded numerous clean tech associations and accelerators. She sits on the SDTC board and was named an Order of the Ordre National de Quebec for her contribution to the clean tech ecosystem. In short, she is the premier player in clean tech investment in Canada, and she's been a member of the Canada's Clean 16 since its first year in 2012 and was named again in 2017.
I'm not alone. I'm working with an amazing team.
You're incredible. And Cycle is one of the largest, is the largest and one of the longest standing investors in Canadian clean tech. You've got 5 offices, $1 billion under management, 5 funds, including one in China. You're clearly the most significant player on the Canadian landscape. I mean, that's why you've been on our list twice. But, so what is it that the government can do to help you and help the companies of which you've invested?
Just before we're speaking about government, I think one thing we did very well, it's work with others. It's impossible to scale up just with money. Because people speaking about money, but we need to speak about skill set. We need to speak about contribution. One thing we did very well, and we did something badly in our story at Cycle, and we did good things too. It's normal. It's always gray zone. But put you in perspective. On our $500 million under management, we deployed $185 million in equity. We are an equity player. We're not a debt player. We're not the grants player. We are an equity player. And we bring with us $1.4 billion in equity in our deals. But it's not just about money. We bring expertise like BASF, ABB, BMW, BlackRock, TPG, very sophisticated investors who can bring to our entrepreneurial teams real support. If I take an example, Enercam, take waste, produce green molecules, can produce methanol, ethanol, different green molecules. But to do that, we need support. We have a chance to Enercam to have Suncor. They put $73 million last year in the company and be very active to support the company in Alberta, in Edmonton, in our first plan. And I think it's clean tech, it's complex because it's not just about technology, it's about transitioning the economy. And what we did well is bring people around the table. The other thing we need to understand, and I think before we speak about what government can do, we need to ask to ourselves what private sector can do. And I think it's very important to have the private sector very committed to this change. Because the public sector can bring their money and support the initiative from the private sector. We need engineers, we need firms, we need consultants, we need corporates, we need big fund manager, pension funds who will be dedicated to make allocation for this transition. The other thing we need to remember, that Canada is not a market. It's a small place on earth. The real market is essentially in Asia. It's China. We have experience in China. It's very difficult. It's very challenging for entrepreneurs to deploy technology in China because it's another culture. And we need absolutely to understand that the next market in 2022 in clean tech will exceed $2.5 trillion in terms of global market. And for that, our entrepreneurs, because we're speaking a lot about technology, but the real thing, it's entrepreneurs. We need to make sure our entrepreneurs are ready to play the big game.
So, Andree-Lise, you're talking about all this opportunity for Canadian clean tech. Is Canada the market that we should be chasing?
The Canadian market is really, really small, as you know. The global market will be, in 2022, will be around 2.5 trillion. And the Canadian contribution will be a smaller contribution to that. And for this reason, we need to prepare our clean tech company, not for the Canadian market only. It's good to make business in Canada, but we need to prepare our entrepreneurial teams to the real world, to the global world. And clean tech and energy transition, it's not about local things, it's about global things. And if your technology will be a solution in Alberta or in Quebec, it's clearly a solution for China, India, or Africa. And how we can prepare as a shareholders level in the team with the talent we have, how we can prepare our Canadian company to be big players in the world. And this crisis, the COVID-19, it's a real risk for Canada. We are really good to support startups company, but we are less good or less very active when it's time to support global deployment for our company. And the risk we are taking actually, the Canadian innovation and the Canadian company can be a target for acquisition, big players who want to put money, and at the end, the shareholders will be more foreign investors than Canadian investors. It's good to have foreign investors. It's very important. We have a chance to work with BlackRock, with BMW, people around the world, and they have an incredible contribution. But we need to have a real base of investors in clean tech in Canada. And the government is really key on this. They need to support with different programs, like the government is doing very well with BDC and EDC, and they need to support different funds to make sure you will have a lot of people around the table who will be a voice for Canadian company around the table.
So if the government puts money into these funds, is that an expense or is that an investment that they can recoup?
They ask for a big IRR, and I think it's good. And the government will not put money in funds or venture capitalist fund just to make sure that they are really active in clean tech. They need to invest with the right purpose, and the right purpose is making money with this innovation. Because if you cannot have a right business plan, if you cannot make money, if you cannot bring revenues, if you cannot be profitable, you will die. It's not just about capitalism. It's about survival. A company with a burn rate during 20 years, it's not a success. If we want to have a success in clean tech, we need to have a successful company. It's go through. And the venture capitalist is not the solution for all companies, but it's part of the solution.
I'd like to pick up on a piece that Andree-Lise was touching on there in terms of demand, right? So we've talked a lot about what the government can do, and there's a whole swath of areas where they can have real impact. But part of that is also creating demand. And so, we need to keep going in terms of our ambitions from a regulatory point of view, a policy point of view, that incents companies to have to move to different technologies to lower their environmental footprints. And so the partnership that you spoke of before with Enercam and Suncor, there are incumbent industries that are looking at what are all the ways that we can actually transition our facilities, our impact, etc. Government has an important role to play in creating demand in industry and in consumers in order to have that pull on all the supply of technologies that all of the efforts have been focusing on as well.
And the other thing the government can do, and it's very crucial, and it's crucial at the federal level and the provincial level, it's put the right regulation. It's not just about money, it's what kind of fiscal or regulation environment we can put in Canada to make sure the company can get their first contract, their first scale-up at home, and perform outside of Canada after. I saw many cases where the first pilot was in Asia or in US. Doesn't make any sense. It's easier for engineering team to deploy first time in their country. And the Canadian government can put tons of money, but will not fix the problem. We need to fix the regulation and the fiscal environment and make sure we have a chance to have a success at home.
Andree-Lise, what is it? I mean, there's different things, different levers that government can pull at this point. Can you talk to us about what some of those might be that would enable the clean tech community to survive and to thrive in a post-COVID world?
Okay, I think they can do, in general, government can do three different things. One thing they are doing very well, actually, it's different program to support company through the COVID-19. If I take an example, EDC and BDC, they put matching fund in the market, and I think it's going well. It's the right thing to do. It's the first step. The second step, they need to be active to pursue their work, to co-invest with the private sector. And I think their presence is really important because we don't have a lot of private money in Canada. And if we want to have Canadian ownership in company, we need to have support like big players like BDC and EDC at federal level, or IQ in Quebec, or different group in different provinces. But the third part, we have few groups in Canada, few venture capitalists specialized in clean tech. And I think it's important to support them and bring their funds at another level. Why? Because generally, VCs like us and others, we are lead investor with fixed terms. And after COVID, post-COVID-19, we will have a lot of opportunities in the market. And if we are enough big, and if we can take a bigger chunk, we can be more active to lead the destinies of company based in Canada. And I think we need to do these three things in the same time. We need all of us.
If I could add a fourth thing that Caroline touched on earlier, and that is the role of government through legislation, through regulations, to actually send critical market signals. And the longer term that signal is, the more powerful it will be. The other thing is to resist the temptation and the demands from some quarters to put certain policies on pause, or to even weaken some policies, which, we've had this pendulum in Canada, particularly at the provincial level, where we have good policy and then it gets ripped out. And then we have good policy again and it gets ripped out. It creates so much uncertainty for investors, for the business community. What we need is a stable policy framework. We've got some long-term climate targets. We now have a suite of policies at the federal level that are either in place or under development. We have to follow through on those. We need to have those long-term signals to the investment community.
Fidel, over to you. And I think Ron probably has some thoughts to add to this as well.
Yeah, I like this list that's really very tactical. It's very, it's all about a return on the investment. And I think that's an important discussion in this. I mean, this is really about money flowing to create an economic driver, but it shouldn't be something that doesn't come back to the tax base. And I think this is wonderful that we're having that conversation about how it is a responsible deployment of capital with a return to those that have put that capital in the hands of government. And I just wanted to add one more piece to this, because when we look at one of the biggest challenges in deployment of clean technology, and I speak at it from the point of view of somebody that's in the deployment portion of things. We're not creating clean tech, but when it comes to us, it comes to us in various different forms. And for us to be able to embed it in what we're doing, it needs to be fully de-risked. It needs to be fully commercialized. It needs to be ready to go. And when we look at that risk category, and you look at the role of the private investor versus the ability for them to take on certain amounts of risk, we really get into this need for financial support in the form of a lending environment that is comfortable with the risk that we're talking about. And that's not what the banks are in a position to be able to do. And so when we look at long-term, low-interest loans with reasonable returns, that there's nothing wrong with that. But I think that a direct lending environment that the government can participate in to really see the deployment of technology happen out there, so that as the private sector puts capital into these things, and as private companies put their reputations on the line to deploy these things, there is the ability to recognize that risk to return basis is never properly managed on the financial lending scenario. So the VCs can do all of the work in terms of getting the technology to market, but to get it from commercialization to deployment, that's really a role for low interest, long-term investment with an appetite for risk. And that last part is always missing when you get to that piece. So I'm sure there's some other pieces on that, but I know in our business, it would make a huge difference to be able to see that type of lending environment created and deployed.
I want to make echo what Fidel said because my experience, we have a chance to have this type of people in the private equity based in US. If I take an example, BlackRock, who's very instrumental in the story of Enercam and Avenue Capital, they are there. They deploy tons of money with us in collaboration with VC at the right stage of the deployment of the technology and the team. And you know, one of our challenge here in Canada, we don't have a lot of this type of private equity later stage who can take the next level, the company. And it's not a bank role, it's more a big private equity role. We have a chance to have incredible relationship with Silicon Valley Bank, for example, who are really active, very supportive. They are in the company at the round B, C, D, and they are ready to deploy. We have an amazing experience in US with SoftBank Energy, who put a check of $80 million to help one of our company to deploy battery in the world. And I think it's probably one of the elements we are missing in the chain. It's have a sophisticated clean tech private equity player who can make the relay in the market for the next step. Because what is very interesting when you work with BlackRock, for example, or Silicon Valley Bank, they have a dedicated team in clean tech, and they know inside out what kind of risk we have in a scale-up.
Fidel and Ron, what gets in the way of you guys actually deploying projects? Is there a way in which the program could be, the existing programs could be tweaked, or do we need new programs?
I'd like to talk about, I think two things. So one is, and building on Cab's comments, the necessity to create an environment that consistently supports the concept that these are good technologies to pursue. So the stable policy environment that Dan mentioned is critical. The commercial industrial customers abhor these changes in policy that happen all the time. We just need them to be consistent, and we're quite happy if they're progressive. I don't think any of our customers get upset about these things. They get upset about them changing all the time. I think it's important that if we're going to explore how we use a green stimulus, that it's a long-lasting stimulus. And that to me means that we do things that don't just result in a bump in activity right now, but that have a long duration to them. And so I think to that effect, I'd be an advocate of let's start with somewhat higher subsidies and have them scale down over time. That will drive activity in the very near term, but it will also provide an environment that supports that demand over a longer period of time, to the point where we don't need subsidies at all, and the demand will just continue on, and we will have permanent jobs, not just jobs that were driven by a short-term stimulus. That's critical. I think the second part is that the things that we're supporting in the marketplace, let the market pick which ones win, right? So setting objectives like building energy efficiency standards or setting renewable energy targets, that's the right way to set the policy directive, and let the market choose the best ways to meet those objectives. It really will do that, and that will drive underlying demand from the commercial industrial sector. The second big point, and it kind of goes to this financing question, many of these things are technologies that cost something up front but have a long-term benefit. If you think of solar as a simple example, it costs something to put a solar array up, and then it's nearly free to operate after that. Very, very low cost. If you think about something like energy efficiency, it costs something to implement that in the building, and then it yields savings over a long period of time, at least 10 years. We're used to buying energy essentially month to month, not really making any commitments to it. That's a change when we're trying to get people to adopt new things, energy efficiency, et cetera. It requires them to make that investment up front. And to Fidel's earlier comment, that's not something we're good at financing right now. Businesses will tend to prefer to finance core underlying elements of their business, a new product line, a new piece of equipment, rather than energy efficiency. So the concept of finding ways to create the right financing structure that supports someone making a 5 or 10 year decision, that's the main barrier. The barrier is actually not the price of these things. It's that it's still a 10, 12% IRR. And you know what? I might just spend it on something that feels more core to my business. That's the barrier we have to remove.
Just to add to what does it mean in the short term? And, there are a number of jurisdictions that have really figured out how to incent economic activity. And they do it by not front-end loading the application process and the evaluation process and that. And we haven't quite figured that out in the Canadian government space. We spend most of our programs, I think, just as a recognition of two things: due diligence, which is appropriate, and the fact that we want to put a fixed number around a budget, really spend more time than the project takes to do to evaluate it and put it through the application phase. And unfortunately, in situations like this, where you're trying to really get people back to work, and when you're really trying to incent that momentum in the marketplace, that philosophy doesn't work very well. What does work is things like you see in the US with investment tax credits. Anything that is built within that fiscal year is eligible for the investment tax credit. What that does is that drives economic activity, because there's a certainty of the outcome, and people aren't hesitating on moving their projects forward. And those things can step down over time, and that creates an even greater incentive to get things going in the short term and moving them forward. I think when we look at New York State, they've also done an excellent job of just recognizing that things can't be completely open-ended, and so they've created very transparent ways of understanding which projects are approaching completion. And as somebody on the ground, you quickly realize that, look, if I don't step up my game, I'm going to be in the next grouping, and the next grouping doesn't get quite as much money on the downside. And that's also been used effectively in the European market. I think we, unfortunately, most of our existing programs are burdened at the front end, and to the point where really good incentives effectively have become disincentives. And that's something that we really want to avoid going forward. And that, especially in the short term, that's going to challenge the rebound and the efficacy of that economic bounce that I think we really, really need at this point.
I think we've talked about this in the past. I think you've mentioned in the past that you can wait 270 days to get approval for a project that might take you 30 days to actually deploy. And in the meantime, nobody's been hired and nothing's happened. But if the project were pre-approved, essentially, if you knew that if you got it completed by December the 31st, you were going to get your investment credit, provided you followed the rules, then presumably you could start tomorrow and hire people the day after.
Yeah, we run into this challenge of shovel ready versus a long application process to determine whether or not that project is actually shovel ready. So when you say, can you deploy in 30 days and then take 270 days to evaluate whether or not that project is deployable in 30 days, does a number of really damaging things. It not only doesn't allow for hiring, it doesn't allow for any capital to be spent on furthering the project until the application is done, because everything is ineligible until approved. But more importantly, it actually stalls capital in the market. So when you look at our space, if you've got somebody that's willing to spend money on a capital project, and they recognize that out of that, they also have tax benefits of spending that capital within this fiscal year. And so they hold that capital with the intent of spending it on a project. And the application process takes so long that they no longer are able to effectively deploy that capital and get the tax benefit in that year. That capital also didn't get spent on core manufacturing or on other core items or other core hiring. So what you've got is you're really paralyzing the flow of capital in that scenario. And what you really need is a very light intent application process. I intend to do the following, and as long as I do what I say I'm going to do, I'm eligible, right? And so that intent statement really helps people track what's going on. It creates a track of what's happening. People have a sense of where those things are at. But it can't be about will you do this? It's if you do this, at which point you're eligible, right? So I'll leave it there. But I mean, this is one of those things that I think is critical for us to get right if we want to see private capital flow and we want jobs created within the calendar year.
I was just going to say the practical reality is that people in business are not sort of searching for these government programs. The practical reality is it's companies like Spark Power and Fidel's company that are going to be the ones that will apply on behalf of customers. Typically, programs make it very complicated to do that. But Fidel is absolutely right. What we have to do is determine the outcomes we're looking for, make that clear, and fund them if and when they deliver against that.
Got it. This is an open question for you guys. Have we told the government what we need, what we want? Have we made it clear? We're closing in on sort of the end of this in terms of time. Is there anything else that we need to add that is critical for government to hear at this point?
I think one thing we need to say is thank you very much for the different COVID-19 program for startups and matching funds. And I can say, and I want to congratulate BDC and EDC, but specifically EDC because I have more experience with them. They are amazing with company actually, and I want to say that first. Next,
okay.
Now, if we are capable to fix the COVID-19 situation and make sure companies will have enough liquidity to go through the next 24 months, it's a big accomplishment. But in our mind, next step, and in the government minds, next step needs to be how I can bring more sophisticated money, more people around the table, and make sure our companies, our Canadian companies, will be not people who went through the crisis, but position themselves as a major player in North America, in the world. And it's time for acquisition. It's time for big play. It's time to be ambitious. Never waste a good crisis.
I'm all in on that. Are there risks to Canadian companies right now that they're essentially bait for companies coming from offshore that could snap them up inexpensively right at the moment?
Okay, in the last 6-7 weeks, we bring $80 million in equity in our company by phone from essentially foreign investors who are really active. It's a real fact. The other thing, we sold one of our company in our portfolio because you have companies in the market who's very active, and the Canadian companies like Spain companies, French companies are a target for multinational companies. But the challenge, if we sell these companies too early in the market, we will not build the real value for Canada. As a VC, I'm fine with that. As a Canadian taxpayer, I have a question for my government. It's, do we want to have this type of landscape, or do we want to be more active, more prominent, and be one of the right players in the world?
Well, that's our future, right? Unless we want to continue to be beholden to oil sheiks in Saudi. It would be good to have our own Canadian industry somewhere. Okay, I'm going to come back around. Is there anything else we need to tell the government? And then we'll do a sort of a roundup in terms of what's your 30-second takeaway kind of thing.
I'll just jump in on that. I think one of the things that many Canadians were both surprised and impressed by is how efficiently the federal government moved in implementing emergency measures for businesses, for individuals, and to some of the points that were raised earlier around a call for shovel-ready projects, but then it takes 5-6 times as long to get through the application process as it would actually take to get those shovels in the ground. There need to be some learnings from how to really focus on that efficiency of both designing the programs and then administering them, so that we can actually get to that economic activity as quickly as possible. And I think because there's higher public trust in government, Canadians have had a good experience with that. I think there's more latitude for the government to really focus on that. Yes, we need due diligence. Yes, we need checks and balances, but we also do need to move both quickly and efficiently on this.
Great point. Anybody else?
Just to not forget some of the things we've touched on before in terms of when we're looking at how do we spend for a clean reset and a clean relaunch and a clean recovery. What are we doing now without cutting off our noses despite our faces for the medium and long term, right? So how are they complementary in-step measures? What is the long game while focusing on getting things going as soon as possible?
Can you give me an example of what you'd be concerned about?
There's only so many resources, and there's lots of there are lots of suggestions going into different levels of government. So what do we fix now that we currently have? How do we top up what we have now to flow more quickly? But let's not forget that we still need to be investing in the research, in the building our small companies, in supporting them in ecosystems that have the right partners, that have the right buyers, and in the long game of how we transforming our economy at the same time. So, we're good at focusing on one thing sometimes and not good at focusing on three things necessarily. So we have to keep that package idea in mind.
I think any stimulus program really needs to start with the concept of focusing on making sure we achieve long-lasting impact, that we create jobs that are permanent, not temporary. Clean tech can be that vehicle. It can be fast and it can be long-lasting. I would start with subsidies that step down over time. That, as Fidel says, drives near-term activity without freezing people out over the long run. We've seen it work in other jurisdictions. We need to think about it here. The second thing, we need to think about creative ways of financing. New York Green Bank is a good model, I think. They creative ways to eliminate little bits of risk while drawing in private capital. It's important to drive that in because it helps drive that long-term change. And it's not money that won't be returned. It will be returned. These are actually not that risky investments. They're just not well understood yet. And finally, the third point is to make sure that we continue with the same policy environment. Business actually wants that. We don't want the changes that keep happening. Let's stay consistent and we will drive long-lasting change from actually a modest amount of subsidy relative to the benefit.
Yeah, I'll just pick up right where Ron left off. So my only challenge is I'm not a big fan of subsidy as a word, and I think that there's a different way to frame it a little bit. I think we have to look at the inherent value above and beyond the initial capital return. And I look at this, if we were to deploy $1 billion in a particular market like solar, and that was to then be leveraged threefold with private money, so really fourfold at the end of the day. What is that money? What is that $1 billion actually doing? And not only is it getting returned on the tax base within less than 2 years, but really what it's doing is it's prepaying for the environmental attributes of that solar energy. Not the electrons. The electrons can be sold commercially on the market. But at the same time, you've got a number of environmental attributes that are critical to this that are accrued over 20 or 30 years. And really what you're doing, and I have to say Alberta really got this right with their Energy Efficiency Alberta. They really framed it, and they did the work and they did the math, and they said what we're doing is we're providing 25% of the capital up front. But what we're taking in return is the full lifetime benefit of the environmental attributes. And so we're taking the carbon, we're taking all the green attributes, we're taking all those pieces, and we're effectively paying for them up front in order to move these projects forward. And I think when you look at it like that, not only is it getting returned within 2 years on the tax base, but you've now prepaid for those things that make it possible for what would be an operating expense to become a capital expense with a return. And everybody wins, right? So that you have the social good in there, you have the environmental good in there, you have the fiscal responsibility. And I think the key part to this conversation is that we need a political beachhead, right? This can't be a football that goes back and forth and becomes a political discussion every time. And I think, it's really interesting because when we look to our neighbors to the south, it's odd, but there are very few things that you can find true bipartisan support on. But one of them is solar. And it's incredible to see. But it is both from the Republican and Democratic side, and this is why it works, and this is why things like the ITC have been in place for so long, and they've been such consistent policy components, because both primary groups there, though they disagree on many things, really understand the benefits of what this does and how it drives things forward. And we need to have that conversation so that all political groups understand that their intrinsic interest and their base really has a benefit in moving these things forward, and it can't be it can't be politicized, and I think that's a big part of moving this conversation forward.
Dan, closing comments?
We need the federal government to really put down a marker and clearly signal that they are going to have a clean, green recovery. We've had lots of speculation about that, some hints of that, but I think they need to put down a marker. We're seeing other jurisdictions doing that. I think we're going to start to see, capital starting to mobilize to go into those jurisdictions. So lay down that marker and then be nimble, be efficient about actually then, moving forward and designing and implementing those programs. And it's going to require leadership from a communications perspective as well to bring Canadians along. And I think there's a really important role for the clean tech industry as well to raise their voices and to tell their stories and to validate that this is the best path forward, not just for the environment, but for the economy. These are the people who are the job creators who are going to draw in additional investment dollars. So, I think we need leadership both from government and from the business community to make sure that Canadians who want to do this actually feel really comfortable that we can and will be successful in that.
I think you had a stat that you shared with me the other day that is it 58% of Canadians actually want to make sure this is a green recovery?
Yeah, so a recent poll found that 58% of Canadians want us to make sure that we're focusing on climate action and addressing climate change at the same time that we're charting our economic recovery. And what's particularly interesting is that 32% of those actually feel more strongly about this in light of their experience with COVID. So, they look at a global collective action problem. They see a collective response in the country and they see that we're having some success with that. And they're saying, let's do that on climate change now.
Andree-Lise?
If I may, if COVID crisis is a black swan, we can fix it with a vaccine. But climate change, it's clearly a gray rhino and no vaccine for that. And I think it's a real opportunity for Canadians to make sure this transition will be green, fast, and very active. Because the gray rhino will destroy all of us. It's easier to fix the small COVID pandemic than a big climate change impact on Earth.
I'd like to thank all the panelists again for their contributions today. I think what we've learned today from the renewable energy industry is that with $1 billion investment, they could activate a further $3 to $4 billion in private capital, and half of that would go directly to wages for new employees, which in turn would produce 50,000 net new jobs. And that would generate enough clean energy to power all of the homes in Ottawa, and further, that from all of that hiring and the added capital, that $1 billion investment would come back into federal income tax coffers within 2 years, producing electricity at the same time for 10 cents a kilowatt hour. We've heard that funding should be outcomes-based, time-limited, and decreasing. The best way to enable shovel-ready projects that could be built in 30 days is not to impose a 270-day process of approval. So we need the government to say, hey, if you build it according to the following set of criteria before, for example, December the 31st, we'll provide a subsidy of up to 25%. And if you build it by next June, we'll provide a 21% subsidy, and by December next year, a 17% subsidy. By declining the amount of subsidy and setting time limits on it, we're going to encourage that the producers and the organizations involved to get shovel ready instantly and produce jobs immediately. What we learned from the clean tech industry is that Canadian clean tech is world class. We're number 4 in the world right now. And that while it's still a small chunk of the Canadian GDP overall, before COVID, it was growing fast and with a world market where demand is simply exploding. So with the right investment now, Canadian clean tech could grow rapidly and double exports from 10 billion to 20 by 2022. But there's also risk. These companies are mostly young, mostly undercapitalized, and thus all at significant risk of being purchased by foreign-based interests. And if that happens, the IP, the technology, and the jobs end up in other places. They need Canadian shareholders, and the Canadian government should be one of them. That there are ways to top up existing funds that will enable the money within those funds to flow to companies that will lead to immediate, near, and longer-term growth. We've heard that the government needs to incent the purchase of Canadian clean tech and to purchase Canadian clean tech itself. And finally, we heard that 58% of Canadians want a clean recovery to the economy to be prioritized, ahead of business as usual, and that the recovery needs to take climate into account. As Canadians, we're always told that the fossil fuel extraction industry is the beating heart of our economy. That's absolutely not true. And here's the other thing. $1 million invested in the fossil fuel industry produces just 2.7 jobs. $1 million invested in any of the Clean Reset programs on which we were suggesting that government focus produces somewhere between 5 and 20 jobs. Clean jobs, jobs of the future, and programs where taxpayer investment would typically be fully repaid to the government within 2 to 3 years. It's not just spending. Government can drive immediate jobs action by making some basic regulatory changes. The Clean50 CleanReset plan includes a broad range of ideas for government reset action, captured in a series of webcasts, podcasts, and videos, all featuring Clean50 award-winning experts. I encourage you to watch or listen to them all and get them from the same place where you consumed this one. More importantly, I'll ask you to do 2 other things. The first is to forward links to these videos to all of your elected officials. In particular, let's get MPs of all parties better educated on what the low carbon economy can look like for Canada, because many don't have a really good idea. The clean economy is durable, well-paid jobs that are not reliant upon the price of oil, as determined by Vladimir Putin or some Saudi sheikh. And the second thing is to send an email, or even better, make a phone call to your MP. Ask them to vote for a clean reset going forward. Tell them it's time to build a low-carbon Canada for the 21st century. For more information on the Clean50 and all our past award winners, please visit clean50.com. I'd like to thank the Trache Family Foundation and the Ivy Foundation for their incredible support, as well as that of our other sponsors who contributed to making these casts possible. I'd like to thank you for watching, and I'd like to thank you for contacting your MP. It's critical. Let's make sure that this time through we have a clean reset.